Okay, so welcome everyone. It is a pleasure for me to introduce James Georgalakis. Many know him through his work as a director of communications at IDS, but today he comes with his other hats as a researcher. And he's doing his research at the University of Bath, focusing on the role of networks and relationships in the mobilization of research knowledge for development. And he has already done some really interesting work on looking at policy networks in epidemics. For example, his piece on UK policy networks in response to Ebola in Sierra Leone in the West African pandemic between 2013 and 2016. And here he showed how sort of what we call like social science experts is actually a very diverse community, much less cohesive than we think, with particular outcomes emerging because of the relationship that happens between those communities. And today James is will not mistaken to explore similar dynamics. So yeah, whenever you're ready, James.
Thanks, James? Santi. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that. Can you give me a thumbs up, Santi, if that's okay? Good. Right. Yeah, so as Santi's explained, I kind of live a double life. By day, I'm IDS's Director of Communications and Impact, but by night, sometimes quite literally, I do my own research as part of a professional doctorate in Bath. And I was, always really interested in this idea of really looking at the scientific communities themselves and how they interact, and then the implications that has for how they engage with policy, particularly in relation to pandemic preparedness and response. And so when, Santi mentioned the paper I published recently on Ebola, and that was published in November 2019. And then, of course, the very following month, this strange and novel new and terrifying new virus emerged in Wuhan. And so from that point onward, I decided it would make total sense to focus my thesis on COVID and on COVID in England, because at the end of the day, I'm living in Britain and I'm British, and my family and myself are going through this crisis along with everybody else. And I just felt, it made sense to focus make the study be focused on England rather than, say, a low or middle income country, which I have no direct experience of. So I'm going to talk through some of the thinking that goes into my approach to the research. I'm not going to be sharing results. I'm just in the process of collecting data. So this is much more about the ontological and epistemological ideas that underpin my approach, which I think do overlap somewhat with some of the work people at IDS are undertaking. So I'm really hoping for feedback and help, and so on, because I'm right in the middle of this. So a collapse of scientific certitude, or as Lorraine Daston describes it, ground zero empiricism, was keenly felt around the European public health response to COVID-19 as the pandemic travelled west in early to mid 2020. And in this environment of extreme uncertainty, competing evidence citing policy narratives rose and fell in the political discourse on COVID. And whether it was arguments about the virus being primarily airborne, or debates about the efficacy of regional lockdowns, the political mantra of following the science can ring pretty empty when the science appears contested. And the accusation levelled at governments and other vested interests is that evidence is cherry-picked that supports an ideological presupposition or political expediency. But science itself is a social institution, and individual and institutional networks of scientists and researchers may become aligned around various epistemologies on contested public health issues. And it's those network behaviours within the UK science and public health communities during that critical first period, that first wave of COVID-19, that is the subject of my doctoral research. So I'm going to tell you today about why I think social network theory and concepts such as thought collectives need to underpin my research, which seeks to map partially hidden epistemic alignment networks during that first wave of COVID in England. So this is concerned with things like trust as a social mechanism for managing complexity, and patchworks of scientific communities that are shaped by partially hidden epistemic alignment networks. And my approach differs from studies of visible health policy networks, in which ties between individuals are identified primarily through co-membership of advisory bodies, bibliometric data, or shared participation in key policy processes, because these visibly connected public health experts and scientists, in some ways you could conceptualize them as the iceberg above the waterline. However, they are connected into a much deeper network of actors. Hence the iceberg analogy. So there's a body of literature and associated theories and concepts spanning the social organization of science and post-normal science, which suggests that these epistemic networks beneath the waterline may collectively help shape evidence-informed policy narratives during periods of extreme epistemic and political uncertainty. And this is basically what I'm going to be talking about for the next 15 minutes or so. So, identifying social organization among scientists is not that easy, given the informal nature of much of the communication between them, between many of you. This research is about people such as people in the IDS community would fall into this category, and a sort of a culture of individualism which still exists in academia. And Diane Crane's approach was to test Price's hypothesis of invisible colleges of elite, mutually interacting and productive scientists within a research area with a sociometric study of epistemic communities. So she started with bibliometric data, such as citations, to build an initial network of scientists publishing in a particular field. And in this case, it happened to be diffusion of agricultural innovations. However, she was interested in identifying links that might not show up in bibliometric data. So something like the influence of a supervisor on a PhD student that's not going to show up in code publication, citation, or acknowledgements. And she was also interested in indirect influence, person A on B and B on C and so on. And so she used a survey to get respondents to nominate individuals who have influenced their thinking. And this produced a series of subgroups, often connected by common connections into a smaller group with relatively weak correlation to citation and co-pub data. And Crane compares a social organization of scientists to a social circle. And the social circle, it's not well instituted compared to entities such as the tribe or the family. There's lots of indirect interaction. So interaction is mediated through intervening parties. And it's not necessary to know a particular member of a social circle to be influenced by her. Now, certain characteristics can be more common to members of a particular social circle than to non-members, but members do not necessarily share, or even do not necessarily share all or even most of these defining characteristics. And therefore, Crane's analysis really steers us away from formal network ties, such as the co-membership of policy advice functions or co-authorship, towards more informal networks of direct and indirect influence. So lots of studies are already happening of who's on the UK Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, for example, and people are looking at who are the members and how are they connected through membership. But what Crane is saying is you have to look beyond those visible ties that you can easily get data on. So thought collectives. So the consequences of these informal relationships was explored extensively by Fleck in his study of the scientific classification of syphilis, of all things. You really read some strange books when you're doing a PhD. But Fleck believes that in any given epoch, science is deeply conditioned by the history and sociology of ideas and human psychology. And he describes the, and I like this, the tenacity of ideas and the harmony of illusions. He disputed that cognition was an individual process, and instead he saw it as a result of social activity. And therefore, like Crane, he sees not individual scientific actors, but communities that share common ideas and influences. Similarly, these groups are informal and bound by epistemological presuppositions. The thought collectives he describes are not bound by visible ties, but are a structured system of ideas. He believed that any epistemological theory that failed to delve deeper than formal activities, such as publication or policy engagement, was of limited value, given cognition remains a fundamentally socially conditioned activity. Therefore, thought collectives are not simply an aggregate sum of the individual members, and individuals are rarely conscious of the prevailing thought style of the collective to which they belong. This concept of individual scientists belonging to thought collectives and unconsciously to thought styles deeply influenced Kuhn's definition of normal science. So Kuhn became the sort of champion of Fleck and his thought collectives almost 3 decades after Fleck actually published his ideas. And it was Kuhn who coined this phrase normal science that described most of science as a series of problem-solving scientific studies designed to fill gaps in knowledge and contribute to learning incrementally. And it was this argument that led Kuhn to describe the work of most scientists and researchers most of the time as mopping up operations, which didn't make him very popular. De Solla Price combined Kuhn and Fleck's sociological approach to understanding scientific communities with network analysis. Investigation of the interactions between the individuals and the collective is encapsulated in the concept of epistemic living spaces, which explore how the personal and the institutional are intertwined and shaped by broader epistemic, symbolic, and political forces. So these various understandings of the formation of epistemological groupings within scientific communities don't actually have very much to say about what drives this, what drives this need for conscious and unconscious cognitive connections. Because to align oneself with others or to feel in some way epistemically at home in a social circle does suggest a leap of faith, particularly during a period of acute uncertainty, like a novel virus. So Luhmann's work on trust seemed to me particularly relevant to my own interest in epistemic communities whose members will appear to sign up to a knowledge system even when their own technical expertise may be narrowly focused. Trust is principally based on familiarity and interpersonal relationships, but Luhmann suggests that for those working in science, this has to be extended to a wider group of fellow travellers in order to manage complexity and uncertainty. This systems trust enables cooperative action or discloses opportunities that might otherwise have seemed too risky in very complex and uncertain situations. But trust is risky because it's got to be based on a combination of knowledge and ignorance. Once the shaping of trust is divorced from factual circumstances, it can be generalized and applied to other similar cases. This generalization of expectations, as he called it, can then be seen as part of a system level set of behaviors that reproduce particular forms of relationships. Luhmann's examples of whole systems trust operate on a much grander scale than Kuhn's scientific networks of a few hundred people. The example he gives is the value of a currency in which all financial transactions are based on a trust in the financial system. Luhmann argues this system trust only exists where the trusting parties believe truth is possible. Everyone must believe at some level that truth sits behind the orientation of the other. So what it makes me think about on a slightly less grand scale than the whole economy is you get in a plane expecting you to reach your destination safely and not fall to your death, not just because of trust in a pilot, but because of system trust. that goes beyond your own technical understanding and knowledge and expertise. So making sense of complexity and dealing with acute uncertainty by placing our trust in others who seem to operate with integrity isn't actually that bad an idea. If you think about it, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning if it wasn't for systems trust. And it's especially true where we think truth is possible. So thought collectives, I think, do indeed help scientists make sense of the world and provide them with a justification to confer trust on others, even though they may never have met them and never will. So Burkhard Holzner is credited with coining the phrase epistemic communities, something which I know a lot of you will be familiar with as a term, as an idea. And this was part of his work on structural social consequences of reality construction. And he describes roles which individuals adopt as being part of a wider network or community. These roles relate to a whole series of different behaviours, attitudes, and identities. The implication is that the roles adopted by individuals in a network might be related to various epistemologies or preference systems, theories, or methodologies. Similarly to Luhmann, he argues that it's self-evident that we tend to rely on the word of others to manage complexity. Roos argues that science can be understood as dynamic and shaped by socio-cultural factors without losing all of its validity. So in other words, it is more than just my facts against your facts. So we can see scientific communities as sort of patchworks of overlapping groups, visible networks, informal thought collectives, and these are built on trust and driven by the need to reduce complexity. And this then, I think, begs an important question. How do these social structures, to which some members may not even realise they belong, shape evidence citing narratives in particular policy contexts? And this is what I'm going to talk about now. The growth of scientific advisory functions in democracies has generated considerable ontological and epistemological work focused on the social and political dynamics of this interaction between science and politics. There is little agreement on what counts as good evidence. This is something we love to talk about at IDS, and how we reconcile epistemic advice and political process. This has been felt acutely in relation to climate science and sustainable development. David Butts-Peterson argues that while science can be epistemically robust without necessarily providing clear policy options, political robustness depends on coming up with options that meet public approval and can be implemented. I think highly relevant to my study here is the work by Melissa and Hayley and Ian and Annie and Santi, of course, who's chairing this session, and their 2021 paper on incertitude and the politics of knowledge is really helpful here, because they argue that back into early to mid 2020, rather than admit to the acute uncertainty of dealing with a novel virus, the UK government simply stuck to the plan that had wrongly anticipated a pandemic influenza. And they regard the expert-driven sort of centralized systems that utilize risk-based epidemiological models as the central problem with Western-style pandemic preparedness and response. And so I would argue, therefore, a useful avenue for further investigation is the social and relational processes that underpin such centralized systems. There are several related research policy network theories that seek to provide a framework for meso-analysis of these social and political structures and their impact on policy and practice. So Peter Haas really defined epistemic communities and how they differ from other groups such as interest groups and advocacy coalitions. And he believes that in a time of crisis and acute uncertainty, policy actors may turn to epistemic communities for advice and that they can influence policy. His definition of epistemic communities is groups with shared common principles and analytical and normative beliefs who have authoritative claim to policy relevant expertise in a particular area. Now, these concepts of these kind of discrete, identifiable epistemic communities and their impact have really been challenged as very simplistic, and it's been argued that the influence of science on policy involves a much more diverse set of actors than those being actively consulted, including activists, the media, funders, professionals, and so on. these multi-sited communities of practice really do bear little similarity to the definition of epistemic communities that Haas came up with. Lorenz Meyer usefully reminds us that rather than just dismiss epistemic communities as an idealized concept or get too hung up on these different sort of definitions, it's really useful to draw upon these competing analytical frames. And my interest here isn't really to do with these network social processes leading to the emergence of a kind of coherent epistemic community. I'm more focused on something that's sort of resembles this idea of epistemic consciousness or cultures, that all of these theories and concepts are underpinned by one way or another. So epistemic alignment is, as a concept, is not predicated on the existence of a clearly defined scientific or epistemic community. So conventional policy communities, as we understand them, are relatively stable, and they're often quite narrowly focused, whereas these wider epistemic networks are built on trust and perceptions of shared values. Despite that, Paul Kearney has attempted to understand the role of scientists in the UK's battle against COVID by using Grant's pressure group conceptual framework. And Kearney's assessment of the UK parliamentary inquiries into the response to COVID during wave 1 was that the British government was in fact largely guided by the science early on. If you look at their policies, he finds they very closely correspond to the advice of a core insider group of scientific advisors. But as Kearney puts it, guided by the science means our scientists, and usually a small group of government scientific advisors. And this included senior ministers forming close professional relationships with those advisors. And Kearney argues that the government actually did rely very heavily on the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, particularly during the initial response. So he refers to the literature on pressure groups to describe the roles of scientists ranging from core insiders, peripheral insiders, and outsiders. Core insiders supported a policy narrative in the run-up to the first lockdown in March 2020. Seems like a very long time ago now, but emphasised long-term management to protect the National Health Service from being overwhelmed. This was at odds with an alternative narrative supported by some outsider scientists who argued for measures that would eliminate the virus altogether. Kearney suggests that the UK COVID experience illustrates two different strategies employed by scientists wishing to influence the government's use of science. So one, you can seek to become or remain an insider and obey the rules of the game in order that decision makers routinely pay attention to science, even if inevitably there are going to be some gaps between the advice and the policy. Or two, you speak truth to power, publicly criticising and drawing attention to the gaps between science and policy. The former strategy requires tailoring your advice to your audience, whereas outsiders can pretty much say what they like, even if this is an indication of their lack of influence. Furthermore, actors who try to criticise government may become less influential as a direct result of this. This is clearly very reminiscent of John Gaventa's Power Cube framework, which talks about a claimed space where outsiders create a claimed space, maybe through activism or advocacy, when they are not invited into those closed spaces and are dealing with various forms of hidden and invisible power. Thus, relations between scientists and their epistemic alignment, I think, could be directly affected by the status that they adopt. So many peripheral insiders who could have potentially assumed a more influential insider status chose to publicly criticise the government. And in doing so, they distanced themselves from those who adopted an insider role. Groups of outsiders who mobilised resistance to the core policy of managing the virus rather than eliminating it, most notably the independent SAGE, which you may remember, they kind of went on, they go on YouTube and they kind of broadcast their kind of alternative advice. The independent SAGE members probably strengthen their epistemic alignment with other, with supportive audiences of other outsiders. Okay, so what does this all mean for my for my study, for my thesis? What am I actually doing? So I mentioned at the beginning, I think I'm currently collecting data. So given these ideas around the social organization of science, thought collectives, system level trust and complexity, and the consequences of the roles played by experts in situations of uncertainty, I feel compelled to explore system level network behaviors. This includes quantitative analysis of network homophily. So this is the tendency of birds of a feather to flock together. We finally got to the title in the seminar. And the identification of subgroups and of key influencers. This analysis of epistemic alignment between actors occupying spaces both above and below the waterline during the early phases of COVID-19 requires the collection of multimodal network data via surveys and interviews. So I start with a seed sample of over 300 scientists and public health officials who were actively seeking to influence the UK's response to COVID in mid-2020, and I asked them to nominate individuals they felt aligned with around specific issues and more broadly. And then the nominees, those that are nominated, are then surveyed themselves in order to deepen the network data. Very early preliminary results demonstrate that this sense of alignment with others did exist. So people can nominate those who they felt aligned with. In some cases, many people. And this was despite the fact that I'm asking them about a period in which there was a paucity of knowledge-based certitude. And you also see repeat nominations occurring almost straight away of those both operating beneath the waterline and above it. So these are going to be the more influential members of the network. Analysis of this network data will identify, I hope, how cognitive and social connections may relate to epistemological, sociocultural, demographic and political attributes of the network members. And it really is my hope that this approach, may go in some small way, may help explain why some types of COVID-19 evidence and understandings of the crisis did appear more resilient than others during such a critical period of the pandemic response. Thanks very much. I'm done.
Great, thanks so much, James. That was really interesting. And so just to reflect on we had envisaged this to be more of a conversation rather than a Q&A. So we invite people to give their comments on James's talk, but also just to see how we can support them taking the research forward. And if anyone has any questions, you can plug them in the chat or raise your hand. And just to warn you that the talk is being recorded, so if by any chance you don't want your question to appear in the recording, then we can turn it off. But to break the ice, I was gonna mention that I found your presentation really thought-provoking, and funnily it sort of links to another area of work that we're doing, which is on the anthropology of ethics related to people's perception of the vaccine. And a lot of the literature there is around this problem with assumptions about how people behave cognitively and the level of reflexivity that people have. And this thought collective's idea really resonates on how a lot of the starting assumptions and a lot of the behaviors that experts have build on this sort of non-reflexive familiarity and sort of underground assumptions. So I think that definitely resonates a lot also with vaccine hesitancy behaviors, in which it's not so much something that is formally thought through as a conundrum, but actually it's what sort of reflects a less reflective process. And I was definitely what you were talking about, this thinking it was going to be an influenza, and that has to do with a lot of the familiarity that both social scientists and natural scientists had of what a pandemic looked like in Europe, and therefore that's why you had this massive divergence between what happened in East Asian countries and what happened in the UK, because, and I think we all sort of were caught in that. It wasn't only because there was this what was called the Signet report, but it was literally around people's familiarity and just assumptions of how things work. So that definitely, and I like how you're sort of bringing together that sort of literature and epistemic communities, bring that complexity and bring that sort of theory around familiarity. And so yeah, I found that really interesting. And just to kickstart the questions, so how do you think this compares to your work in Sierra Leone? Like, was there something different to like doing research at home for a pandemic at home to the sort of more north-south work that was being done by UK scientists for the West African pandemic?
Thanks, Santi. Yeah, it is different. And I guess I've been on a bit of a journey. So back when I was writing about the UK mission to Sierra Leone, I was focusing much more on that visible network of actors, and starting with a relatively simple premise of who gets to go to what meetings, and looking at testing this idea that there was this there was a lot of integration of social science into the response by simply pointing out that there wasn't that much, not as much as we would have liked, and that you're dealing with a very closely knit community of UK experts that was already dominated by biomedical science. And so it was quite difficult to break into that, and even more difficult to bring in Southern perspectives directly. I think I found that one member of the entire network was from, maybe there was two, were from the global South and were non-white, So I guess what's different here is I'm really focusing in on the scientists themselves rather than the political mechanism for engaging them. So really thinking about really focusing in on that idea of epistemic alignment, as opposed to which disciplines are better represented within, say, advisory functions. Because I've just become increasingly fascinated by that, and that applies to everyone. So, it's easy. It's relatively easy to focus on the political actors and say, aren't they terrible and hopeless, and they listen too much to the biomedical community. I mean, that's pretty straightforward and pretty clear. But it's really interesting when you start to see, in that, I don't know if you can all remember back to what the social media was like during that period, but quite respectable people were kind of calling for other people's resignations. I mean, from within the academic community, left, right, and centre. It was a difficult time where people felt very strongly aligned or non-aligned with others. Sometimes people within their own institutions, and yet no one really knew anything about the virus at that point. And so that's quite interesting, that there is this need there appears to be a strong need to locate how you feel, what you feel is the appropriate response within the community. So I guess I've moved further away from being policy research into this being sociology through and through, which I hadn't expected. It's all kind of happened by accident. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And Hayley?
Thanks, Santi and James. I'm really sorry. We actually had a pandemic preparedness project meeting, so I joined late. So my apologies if my question is partly ill-informed because I didn't hear the first part. But I guess I wanted to pick up on Santi's point and partly just to ask a bit how you're understanding this epistemic consciousness, because so my reflection would be that actually, where does disciplinary difference come in there, I think is my question, because I think that is quite an important question in the UK context, and goes back to the point you've just been making about who was drawn in and who those insiders were, and of course there's been a lot of comment about modelers and epidemiologists, and that there were fewer social scientists in the UK. So, to what extent do those kind of disciplinary silos play in? And surely part of the conversation should be about connecting different epistemic communities or disciplinary communities, and that I think just takes more energy to do, and I think not all governments are really willing to put that in. And I think that also goes to this, these hierarchies of which you hinted at what kind of science matters. And I mean, I'm sure you've no doubt listened to some of the interviews that have come out with particularly the civil servants who are scientists. For example, I'm thinking of Patrick Valence's reflections on his involvement with, in SAGE, and, him actually making the point in that interview. I think it was for the that science program. I can't remember, the one that Pallet Ghosh leads for BBC4. That interview has been much discussed because he actually explicitly said, oh, well, the social scientists, they can't keep the science neutral. They want to give policy advice, but us true scientists, we sort of can separate it out. Whereas in fact, people I know who have been on SAGE have said actually he's a master at the politics. So there's also that interesting conversation. Of course, Indie SAGE have been accused of being political, and so I guess it's, there are those sort of complexities of how science is perceived as well that kind of play into all of this. So I'd also like just further reflection on Indie SAGE and whether you feel that has been an effective body to some extent, even if they haven't been on the inside, and bearing in mind that David King has actually now gone off to establish a similar independent kind of committee related to the climate change debate. So do you see that as a format that might persist?
Thanks, Hayley.
Yeah, thanks, Hayley. Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously, very interested in sort of concepts of hierarchies of knowledge. I kind of want to look beyond. I guess I'm trying to look a bit beyond the disciplinary silos, because they're going to be there, and they will be flagged up in the network analysis, because every network, every node in the network is going to be, identified with a disciplinary association, and so we're going to see that emerge. But I'm interested in that there's been clearly also deep divisions within disciplines, and so for example, there were definitely not all virologists and epidemiologists were kind of equally on the inside feeling listened to. So I think it's, rather than this become a social scientists versus the world kind of narrative, I'm quite keen to explore what's going on even within disciplinary silos, and what drives this kind of the formation of some of these kind of networks of alignment, where and it may be that I find it does conform very closely to disciplines, but I think there's probably some examples where it's going to show some further complexity. The question about whether I think independent SAGE has been effective, I mean, I can only, this is me kind of speaking more, this isn't really something my research is going to address directly. It's not going to tell us which were the most effective strategies. I think there is a real challenge around, there are many who have worked quietly and constructively within government, who we don't hear from. And so, that's an aspect of this which we don't really get a sense of. And then there are independent SAGE. I think they did a good job in raising awareness of those issues, but whether they had, I think there are very few people who can play both the outsider and the insider game simultaneously. But one person, for example, who was effective was Trish Greenhalgh. So Trish is an example of someone who managed to be unbelievably critical of government. She was outside of SAGE. She was furious over things like the refusal of the UK government to introduce mandatory face mask wearing in the community. and she campaigned very publicly, and actually she influenced that change. So you certainly do need people to be actively engaging in advocacy on the outside. And that's the classic example, right? Is the face mask. So I gave this presentation to a group earlier, a few weeks ago in Bath, including 2 members of SAGE, and one of them, who was a physicist, said, oh, when I mentioned face masks and airborne transmission, she said, oh, that's fine, we've got the data now. We've got the data, so we know what to do now. I'm like, yeah, but the whole point is you didn't have the data during the first wave. And because you didn't have the data, NervTag refused to say to government, we think they wouldn't make that recommendation. Whereas others like Trish were saying, that's crazy, look what's happening in Asia, surely it's worth a try. And that's where your thought collective, thought style differs, both within SAGE and on the outside.
Thanks, James. I was also thinking that there was indeed a change in which, when you look at the literature around influenza, you would have a point in which you would say community transmission has happened. We can sort of let go of test and trace, and that was the original sort of I guess Cummings' original discourse, and then there was a backlash against that, in which test and trace was instituted late, but it was brought in. So I guess it'd be interesting to see who influenced that sort of shift back. And that was just a comment. And Peter?
Yeah, thanks, James, and Santi too. Very interesting. It's actually good to hear what you're doing your research on, because we never seem to get a chance to talk about that. So that's excellent. I think the thing I'm interested in, I guess it extends a little bit again from the conversation around disciplinary sort of backgrounds, and also diversity of where people come from different geographies and different contexts. All of that's important. But I just wondered whether you were at all considering the kind of composite of what I'll refer to as learning styles of people within these thought collectives. So, if we go back to adult education theory, there's this idea that, as human beings, we tend to orient naturally, to a large extent, towards different kinds of learning style. Some of us are experimentally oriented, some are natural reflectors, some are more naturally inclined towards conceptualization, theorization, and others are very action oriented. And I suppose it's interesting, you're talking about thought collectives, which suggests particular kind of orientation of ways of being in the world. Patrick Vallance was just mentioned, and clearly there's an interesting example of somebody who's very strong conceptually, but also is a pragmatist, which is another of those learning styles, and is able to navigate power and politics in ways which sort of blends these different kinds of ways of being and ways of learning, and then which I think informs ways of behaving. And so if you get within a thought collective people who, a group of people who are predominantly theorists, for example, I think that tends to generate certain kinds of behaviors, which perhaps tend to generate kind of predictable types of outcome, because they're thinking alike. It's the classic echo chamber sort of challenge, where people may have different views, but they're coming at it from a particular way of, locating themselves in the world. And we know so much that, as the work that many colleagues are doing, including on this call, that in the end it's about emotional connection. It's about engaging with people and communities in ways which are certainly not only relating to cognitive processes. There's strong emotional dimensions. There's the way in which people sort of visualize where they are in the world, and all these different dimensions. So I realized it takes it into a different kind of territory, but is that something which you think the way in which people end up being in a particular space because they have a natural predilection, they're recognizable to each other, therefore you get a kind of community which is formed by people who operate in the world in a similar way, which perhaps then excludes people who would bring quite different ways of thinking about shared problems or relating to shared problems, because they naturally be inclined. Typically you find action-oriented people end up in NGOs. Let's say you can say that because it's a home for them. It's very much towards putting theories into practice and then seeing what happens. That's a generalization, but broadly, I think you can kind of see these kinds of natural homes for different groups of people. So I just wondered whether that's something that might configure somewhere in your thinking. Thanks, but really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think it's really the sort of suggestion I was hoping I'd get out of this session. I think, yeah, adult learning and learning styles is something I could be exploring maybe in the stage where I'm doing the more qualitative research and talking to people and interviewing people. I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, what do I say about learning, of course, is most people don't understand how something like SAGE actually works. I mean, the thing about SAGE is these poor people on SAGE that we hold responsible for all the woes. I mean, of course, they're not in a really learning environment. What they get given is a list of questions by the government, and they give them answers. I mean, straight away you've got a problem there, right? Because the government are predetermining what the questions are, and so that small group of real insiders, who, as you say, might exhibit a particular type of cognitive process and way of thinking about it, are setting that agenda right from the outset. There's actually quite a lot of diversity in SAGE and its associated committees. Yeah, I'll give that some thought. Thank you.
Joe?
Thank you. My internet connection is quite bad. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I might just turn my camera off just in case. James, thank you. It's really, really fascinating to listen to your presentation. I really like the way that you were talking about outsiders and sort of highlighting how divisive it was at the beginning. I had just a comment wondering if I wonder if independent SAGE are really the true outsiders, and I wondered if you'd given any thought to people like maybe Sunetra Gupta, who sort of had her reputation destroyed through this. You were talking about how, people within their own communities were attacked by each other, but I'm thinking about where did all the sort of almost like dissident scientists who are part of the Hart Group or Great Barrington Declaration, or people who've been sort of attacked and had their platforms reduced, where do they fit into this, and what might that mean for how knowledge is created? Because I'm thinking it's really interesting you're talking about cognition not being an individual process. So it made me think about back to the dialectic and those kind of things. What does that mean if a whole one side or a whole part of the debate is sort of closed off? Could even be thinking about what about people like Robert Malone, who's now been completely destroyed as an academic? What does that mean for this? And is there anything that Power Cube and Foucauldian kind of lens can say about it, if that's not too sort of off topic?
No, it's not off topic, and of course Sunetra Gupta and those like her get a lot of nominations, right, in this network data, because they're polarizing individuals. Yeah. Because I'm asking people both to nominate people they feel aligned with, but I'm also asking to nominate people they don't feel aligned with, and you get a pattern of behavior where what I'm hoping I'll find is you will see a pattern emerging where certain groups may nominate Sunetra Gupta as one of the people they feel non-aligned with, and certain groups will tend to do the opposite. Same with someone like Trish Greenhalgh, very similar. Mm-hmm. Trish is either someone people felt strongly aligned with or strongly non-aligned with. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground, and that's really interesting. So those actors do have a kind of the Great Barrington Declaration, of course, was hugely controversial at the time, and it's kind of really polarized opinion. What is interesting is how quick people were to call for people's resignations and to have very strong views on individuals based on their perceived role as either insiders or outsiders. But for all of those very well publicized individuals, my argument is that there's many more operating, quietly, either operating quietly in a kind of more outsider mode, or operating very quietly and in a constructive way of working with government. And this comes down, Joe, to people's idea of how change happens, right? We talk about this a lot in KIP. So if you're a kind of activist person who believes it's all the best thing you can do is speak truth to power, then that's how you end up on something like independent sage. But there are others who strongly believe that's not an effective way to influence change, and it's counterproductive, not because they're super conservatives or even because they're, belong to a particular scientific discipline. They simply don't think that is the way to influence change. They would rather work as a peripheral insider who maintains their independence, but tries to, as Kearney puts it, they play by the rules to some degree in order to try and have a voice. And so it really, and that in itself is a thought style. So, I would say, I would put myself out here and say at IDS, it's common to belong to the former. We kind of like the idea of being activists and outsiders and shouting, speaking truth to power. That kind of is that's a comfortable place for us to be. That's kind of sits with our ideological it sits with us quite well ideologically, but that's not how everyone thinks.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
James. Any more questions? I was going to reflect that this actually resonates as well, again, with the sort of literature on sort of moral psychology on sort of people's moral frameworks when they engage with the world. So this work by Jonathan Haidt, that he was looking at the difference between conservatives and how that is also a dimension on those researchers and how they relate themselves to broader society, how much they're sort of more supporting autonomy, supporting community, supporting other sort of values. And I guess sort of this kind of independent sage and Devi Sridhar, and they have sort of more a collective oriented ethics. So and I wonder, and then I guess Stephen Riker and they were trying to bring that in to the government, whereas the government had very sort of individualistic, and they came up with this weird concept of fatigue to think about. So yeah, I was wondering if you think there's something unique about how behavioral science has been incorporated here, because they sort of, it seems like there was one step in, but not necessarily following a lot of the previous research that was done on sort of behavior in emergencies.
Yeah, I know. I think it's interesting. I don't think I'm familiar enough with some of that literature on moral frameworks, but I do think the impact, the way the perceived dominance of behavioral scientists has been interpreted is really interesting. And this idea that there's kind of its tin pot behavioral science has been allowed to have too much influence on and it's somehow not rigorous, and it's not robust, and it's too top down. And some of those ideas, both the supporters of the behavioral science approach and its critics are divided along very kind of ideas that are very conceptual, right, and epistemic in themselves, how we think the world really works. And so so I can't comment fully, Santi. I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's also worth pointing out, this thesis, it has to be quite narrowly focused to get anywhere. So ultimately, I'm not going to answer all these questions, but what I'm going to do is produce a bit of data, hopefully, if I can get people to give me their data, which is proving quite hard, because you can imagine it's extremely sensitive data. And, use that data to perhaps illustrate whether or not, some of these concepts that you will see patterns in alignment based on particular identities, thoughts, sort of moral frameworks and disciplinary associations, whether those do emerge, or whether we're just going to see one big lump of social scientists on one end and one big lump of everyone else on the other end, which is useful but a bit less interesting.
Well, thanks, James. That was a fascinating talk and really interesting questions that have been raised. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks, James, for his presentation. And we're really looking forward to read your piece when you're finished.
Might take a while. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, James. Great to hear it.